Welcome to the mysterious casebook. In a quiet English manner, a pair of elegant gloves bears a stain no laundry could wash away. Tonight, Miss Marple observes what others dismiss as the ashes of deceit upon silk and lace. Where are you listening from this evening? Now, pour your tea and let the mystery begin. It was one of those late spring afternoons when St. Mary Mead seemed to breathe contentment, as if the air itself were steeped in tea and lilac. The choir practice had just ended at St. Mary's, and a trickle of parishioners was crossing the green women in straw hats and men with mild opinions. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, stood outside the lich gate speaking to Mrs. Price Ridley in that gentle tone of mild reproach that always sounded like Christian forgiveness. Only the faint scent of something burning, not unpleasant, merely curious, drifted from the direction of the Dalrymple house on the hill. Miss Marple, passing with her shopping basket, noticed it too. She paused, ever so slightly, as if the smell reminded her of something. "Garden waste, I dare say," murmured Mr. Hawes, the verger, who had come up behind her with a cautious smile. "Her ladyship's gardener at it again. Never mind the by-laws when it comes to ashes." Miss Marple's blue eyes narrowed a fraction. "Ah," she said mildly. "Ashes have a way of containing what one would rather forget." The remark passed like a ripple in a pond hardly noticed, yet disturbing the reflection of the quiet scene. Children wheeled hoops along the path, and the postman nodded at the women carrying hymn books. But already the village air had altered imperceptibly, like a clock hesitating between ticks. By the following morning, everyone in St. Mary Mead knew that Lady Dalrymple had fainted in her drawing-room during tea, and that the maid, Clara, had been dismissed for impudence and deceit. Mrs. Bantry, hearing the tale at the grocer's, declared it too scandalous for words, while Miss Hartnell insisted it was no more than that dreadful girl deserved. Miss Marple said nothing at all. She merely rearranged the lace handkerchief in her bag and asked whether Lady Dalrymple had sent for Dr. Haydock. "She refuses to see anyone," said Mrs. Bantry, lowering her voice with relish. "Except, of course, Colonel Dalrymple, and he's been looking most peculiar white as chalk. One hears things, you know, Jane." Miss Marple inclined her head. "One always does." By midday, the village grapevine had embroidered the story with a dozen new threads. Clara had stolen jewelry. Clara had been caught with a letter. Clara had accused her mistress of cruelty. Each version shifted the moral balance, letting the speaker feel virtuous in her judgment. Miss Marple always listened as though she were hearing variations on an old theme. When the vicar called that afternoon, ostensibly to ask Lady Dalrymple about the bazaar committee, he was met at the door by the butler, grimly, whose usual stiffness seemed bent double beneath some private strain. "Her ladyship is indisposed," he said. "She has requested no callers." The words sounded rehearsed, the eyes uncertain. From within the house came the faint tick of a clock, and once a rustle of papers hastily hidden. That evening, a strange hush fell over the green. Curtains were drawn earlier than usual, and even the gossip at the post office seemed subdued, as though everyone sensed a wrong note but could not name it. Miss Marple, knitting by her window, observed the lamplight flicker in the Dalrymple drawing-room across the way. It blinked twice off again, before steadying. A small thing, perhaps, but in St. Mary Mead such trifles held weight. The next day brought rain, soft and persistent, which drove the villagers indoors to their parlors and parlor minds. Yet the talk refused to die. The baker's boy swore he had seen Clara leave on the late train with a single suitcase. The station master added that she had been crying. The pattern of speculation grew elaborate, each thread crossing another until truth and invention became indistinguishable. Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Clement that afternoon, the conversation meandering between hymn selections and the vicar's absent-mindedness before returning, inevitably, to Lady Dalrymple. "She looked so proud last week," said Mrs. Clement softly. "Those gloves of hers, grey suede, immaculate. She wore them even indoors. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. Pride takes many forms, my dear. Sometimes it's in the way we keep our gloves spotless, even when our hands are trembling underneath. When Miss Marple returned home through the drizzle, she paused at the corner where the lane turned toward the Dalrymple house. A constable stood by the gate, speaking to a man in an overcoat. There was an unmistakable air of quiet authority in the man's stance, Detective Inspector Crail from Melchester, if she was not mistaken. The faint smell of smoke lingered still, though the rain had nearly washed it away. Miss Marple watched as a footman carried a small parcel, carefully wrapped in paper, to the inspector's car. She continued on, the rain hissing gently on her umbrella, her thoughts ordered yet unsettled. Something had shifted subtly, like the hush before a confession. When she reached her cottage, she laid her knitting aside and lit a single lamp. Through the misted window, she could just discern the dark smudge of the Dalrymple house above the green. "Poor Lady Dalrymple," she murmured. One wonders what it was she was so determined to keep clean. Outside, thunder murmured distantly, a promise rather than a threat, and the faint scent of ashes drifted once more through the rain. The faint scent of ashes lingered in the air long after the rain ceased, as though the village itself were reluctant to draw a clean breath. Morning sunlight came timidly through thin clouds, glinting off puddles and the polished brass of the post office sign. Miss Marple's curtains were already drawn back. She sat with her knitting untouched, watching two figures speaking outside the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley, in her uncompromising hat, and Colonel Dalrymple, who looked more weathered than ever in his mackintosh. He removed his hat with mechanical courtesy, but his eyes had the faraway look of a man not wholly present. It was peculiar, Miss Marple reflected, how grief and guilt could resemble each other so closely that even the kindest observer might mistake one for the other. She noticed that the colonel's gloves, once as immaculate as his wife's, were now stained at the fingertips as if from soil or ink. When Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward with a question, his hand jerked slightly, betraying impatience. Then he turned sharply and strode toward the hill, leaving the lady blinking in affront. Later that morning, Dr. Haydock called at Miss Marple's cottage under the polite pretext of checking on her rheumatism. "Quite unnecessary, Doctor," she said with her usual composure, offering tea. "But I fancy you'd rather talk about Lady Dalrymple." He gave a short laugh. "You always see through me, Jane. Well, she's confined herself to her room, grimly let me in only after some persuasion. She's pale as a ghost and trembling like one of your teacups, but perfectly coherent. She insists she merely overexerted herself." Miss Marple poured his tea thoughtfully. "One wonders, then, why the police are so attentive." "Something about a letter," Haydock said. Grimly mentioned the inspector found fragments of burned paper in the fireplace. Confidential correspondence, perhaps, her ladyship's known for guarding appearances. He paused, eyes narrowing. "And between ourselves, I'd say she's terrified. Not merely nervous, terrified." Miss Marple nodded, the needles in her lap glinting faintly in the morning light. "Terror," she said gently, "can be such a private thing, can it not? Sometimes it hides behind a tidy hearth." By afternoon, the green was alive with talk again. Mrs. Bantry's maid claimed that Lady Dalrymple had received a mysterious visitor the evening before her fainting spell, a gentleman from London, she insisted, though none could say how she knew. Mr. Hawes, the verger, reported that Grimley had asked to borrow matches, muttering about getting rid of things before they're seen. Each whisper seemed to breed another, like ivy sprouting from old mortar. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement struggled to maintain a pious neutrality. "We mustn't judge, my dear," she told Miss Marple, though her eyes shone with curiosity. "Lady Dalrymple has always done much for the parish, her charities alone." She faltered when her husband entered, brow furrowed with concern. "My dear," said the vicar gravely, "it appears Lady Dalrymple has requested police protection for the night." Mrs. Clement gasped. Protection? From whom? That, he said quietly, they have not disclosed. Miss Marple folded her hands upon her lap, the faintest trace of colour returning to her cheeks. How odd, she murmured. When fear arrives at one's own door, one generally knows its name. The day's calm faltered toward dusk. The sun bled red across the rooftops as if the village itself were blushing at the scandal it had nurtured. From her window, Miss Marple saw Inspector Crail again, his silhouette rigid at the Dalrymple gate. A constable held a paper bag, its contents dark against the lamplight, perhaps more ashes, perhaps something else entirely. The butler grimly hovered behind them, his composure cracking like old varnish. Then the church bell tolled 6, and the sound carried across the damp air, solemn and measured. Miss Marple rose and fetched her shawl. She walked to the gate just as Mrs. Bantry appeared from the lane, breathless with fresh tidings. You've heard, of course. About the gloves, they say Lady Dalrymple's grey gloves, the ones she wore last week, have been found scorched, nearly black at the fingertips. The inspector took them away in that horrid little bag. Miss Marple frowned slightly. Scorched, you say? How curious. One would think ashes rarely cling to such fine suede. She let the words hang, mild yet pointed, as Mrs. Bantry's excitement wilted under the weight of them. The two women stood in silence for a moment, the evening light turning the puddles gold. Far up the lane, a shutter closed with a decisive thud. Well, said Mrs. Bantry, half whispering, some people bring their misfortunes on themselves. There are stories, old ones, about the Dalrymples, but of course you would know. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Only that human nature, my dear, seldom changes. It merely dresses differently for tea. When she returned inside, the scent of rain and faint smoke followed her. On her small table lay the morning's Post, a circular about the church bazaar, a note from her niece, and a pressed violet that must have slipped from her gardening book. She looked at it thoughtfully. Delicate, easily crushed, yet capable of leaving its stain even after burning. She pinned the flower beside her lamp and sat quietly, the rhythm of the clock steady in the hush. Somewhere beyond, a dog barked once, then ceased, as though warned by something unseen. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the dark outline of the Dalrymple house. A single thought, half-formed and soundless, crossed her mind, not yet deduction, merely the whisper of its beginning. The lamplight cast a mild golden halo about Miss Marple's knitting basket, the single point of warmth in a room otherwise composed of silence. She had not moved for some minutes, her eyes tracing faint reflections on the window pane. Somewhere down the lane, a carriage door closed with the soft finality that accompanies official business. Inspector Crail was making his rounds early, and that, Miss Marple reflected, was seldom a sign of confidence. A knock at her door confirmed it. In the evening, Miss Marple, came a voice both polite and pragmatic. Sorry to disturb you. The inspector entered, cap in hand, and paused, as though aware that every movement would be quietly assessed. You may have heard a bit of chatter about the Dalrymple affair, he began. I'd rather the facts were clearer before the whole parish takes it for gospel. Miss Marple inclined her head. The parish inspector tends to fill any vacuum of knowledge with embroidery. She gestured to a chair. Perhaps it would help if you unpicked a few threads. He smiled, despite himself. Well then. A maid dismissed, a fainting fit, and a set of gloves burned beyond reason. Grimley claims Lady Dalrymple took tea alone that afternoon, but Dr. Haydock says she wasn't in a state to pour her own tea. And there's this. He drew a folded paper from his coat pocket and placed it on the table, a charred scrap, its edges blackened, the center bearing half a line of ink. The words, faint but legible, read, "Will ruin us both, dramatic," Miss Marple murmured, examining it with detached curiosity, yet conveniently incomplete. "We found it in the drawing-room grate," Crail said, "and her ladyship insists it's nothing an old note she was disposing of. Claims she can't remember the rest." His eyes met hers. "You've known her longer than I have, ma'am. Would you call her truthful?" Miss Marple gave a gentle sigh. "Truth, Inspector, can be a matter of breeding. Those born to command often forget that concealment is a form of falsehood. I dare say Lady Dalrymple's version will be the one she believes least damaging." Crail tucked the paper away, a glint of dry amusement in his eyes. "Then perhaps she's protecting someone. Or herself." He rose to leave. "We'll keep watch tonight. I'd advise you to keep your door bolted, just precaution, you understand." When he had gone, Miss Marple sat still a moment longer, listening to the rain tapering to a mist. Her thoughts drifted not to fear, but to pattern. People, she knew, arranged their lives like lace symmetrical at first glance, yet with tiny gaps betraying the design. Somewhere amid the ashes and the gloves, a small human motive hid tidy, perhaps, but not innocent. The following morning brought deceptive brightness. The air was washed clean and the village wore its politeness like a Sunday coat. At the market, the talk had regained its comfortable rhythm, though each exchange bore a faint undercurrent of inquiry. Miss Marple stopped to speak with the fishmonger, who mentioned in that careless tone of someone not careless at all that Colonel Dalrymple had been seen at the station, sending a telegram to London. Looked put out? He did. Said it was family matters. Funny thing to say, seeing as there's no family left but her ladyship. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had collected more than her share of fragments, Grimley's unusual purchase of cleaning spirits, the grocer's complaint that Lady Dalrymple's account was in arrears for the first time in years, and Mrs. Bantry's claim that a stranger had asked directions to the Dalrymple estate on the previous Thursday. "Foreign-looking," she'd said with relish. "Dark hair, hat too fine for the country. I said he'd find nothing here worth stealing." At noon, Dr. Haydock returned for another visit. "She's calmer," he told Miss Marple later, "though there's something off in her manner. Keeps asking whether the maid's been located. When I said she'd left on the late train, she muttered, 'That's what they want you to believe.' Then begged me to forget she'd said it." He rubbed his temple. "Between you and me, Jane, the woman's near collapse." Miss Marple listened with mild sympathy. "Ah, but collapse often follows the strain of maintaining composure. One must respect the effort." She spent the afternoon walking the lanes, her steps slow but purposeful. The village shimmered in its deceptive calm, whitewashed cottages, tidy hedges, the hum of distant bees. Yet beneath it all, she sensed a brittle edge, the strain of surfaces kept too polished. She paused by the Dalrymple gate where the constable stood guard, nodding to her with restrained courtesy. Beyond him, the drive curved toward the house where curtains were drawn despite the sunlight. On her way back, she stopped at the churchyard wall to rest. There, she met young Lily Pratt, one of the scullery maids from the Dalrymple household, pale and nervous. "Oh, Miss Marple," the girl whispered. "They say Clara left, but she didn't say goodbye. She'd never do that, not to me. And that smell of burning, it wasn't garden rubbish, I swear. It was her ladyship's gloves and papers, all thrown in at once." Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on the girl's arm. "Best keep such thoughts quiet for now, my dear. Words, like ashes, have a way of drifting where they shouldn't." The girl nodded, trembling, and hurried off. As Miss Marple continued homeward, the distant sound of a clock chimed the half-hour precise, decorous, indifferent. She paused at her gate, eyes thoughtful. In St. Mary Mead, she reflected, respectability was the most fragile disguise of all. The next breeze stirred faintly through her garden, carrying the ghost of that same burnt scent, softened by lilac. Miss Marple drew the latch and went inside, her mind already sifting through the pattern of what had been said, and what had been carefully left unsaid. The faint scent of lilac clung to the cottage air, mingling with the subtler tang of smoke that had no business lingering so long. Miss Marple stood by her writing desk, sorting her thoughts as she might sort embroidery thread carefully, by shade. Somewhere between the scent and the silence lay something slightly out of place, the untruth within the picture of composure. That, she felt certain, was where the trouble would be found. A knock at her garden gate interrupted her reflection. Colonel Dalrymple entered, his military precision somewhat dulled by exhaustion. "I trust you'll forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple," he said, stiffly. "I thought perhaps you might, you've a way of seeing through foolishness." His voice faltered as he removed his hat, revealing a flush that suggested both sleeplessness and guilt. Miss Marple gestured toward the armchair by the window. "You'll find the tea fresh. I always think honesty comes easier with a cup in hand." He sat heavily, turning the hat between his fingers. "It's this business with my wife. The inspector seems to think I've not told him all. Truth is, I've told him more than I ought." He gave a dry, mirthless laugh. "I was in London the day before she fainted. That much I admitted. What I didn't tell him was why." Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "Why, then?" "To see my solicitor." He glanced toward the window, as though gauging how far gossip might carry. "I intended to ask about separation. My wife and I have not been compatible of late. There were debts, you see, and a quarrel about a letter that came some weeks ago." He hesitated. "It's gone now, burnt, but I fear the inspector knows of it." Miss Marple poured his tea with quiet precision. "A letter that would ruin you both, perhaps." His head jerked up. "You've heard." "Only whispers," she said lightly. "But whispers tend to echo where truth hides." He stared into his cup. "Then they'll say it was me, won't they? That I frightened her, that I burnt it. I swear, I've never laid a hand on her. She's always been, how shall I put it, delicate about appearances. She'd rather destroy a truth than admit it existed." Miss Marple nodded gently, her gaze resting on the rim of his cup. "And you, Colonel, are you equally delicate?" He gave a faint, bitter smile. "My dear lady, no one in the army survives without a little concealment. But there's honor in it, usually." When he left, the air felt heavier, as though the conversation had left behind a trace of despair. Miss Marple stood for a long moment, thinking of the man's unpolished sincerity. If guilt were measured by discomfort alone, half of St. Mary Mead would hang by supper. By late afternoon, the inspector's car returned to the Dalrymple gate. This time, Mrs. Price Ridley was loitering on the green, ostensibly to gather dandelion leaves for her tortoise, but plainly there to observe. "They've taken Grimley in for questioning," she told Miss Marple breathlessly when they met outside the post office. "The butler. Imagine, they say he altered the household account books and pocketed the difference. Her ladyship threatened dismissal only last week." Miss Marple expressed mild surprise. "Such things are not uncommon, my dear. But I wonder, did Grimley seem the sort to risk ruin for so small a profit?" "He's a sly one," said Mrs. Price Ridley, nodding emphatically. "Always quoting Shakespeare when one asked for salt at dinner. And that look he gave when the constable led him off smug, if you ask me." Later, at the vicarage tea, Mrs. Clement echoed the sentiment with a trace more charity. "He's been with the family for decades. One must pity him if temptation got the better of his judgment." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Temptation, yes, but not always to steal. Sometimes merely to conceal." Her voice drifted into the gentle murmur of polite talk, but her thoughts were already circling elsewhere. Grimley, for all his stiffness, was a man ruled by routine. A person who polished silver by habit would not forget to wipe soot from a grate unless he wanted it noticed. That evening, she saw the inspector again near the churchyard. He appeared weary but confident. "We've reason to think Grimley forged her ladyship's signature," he told her quietly. "Bills, letters, small sums, enough to give him motive for destroying evidence." He paused, searching her expression. "Between us, ma'am, I think we've found our man." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her tone almost apologetic. "How comforting, Inspector. The village does so prefer its villains tidy and its mysteries brief." He chuckled, mistaking the irony for agreement, and tipped his hat before departing. When his footsteps faded, Miss Marple turned toward the Dalrymple house. The curtains were drawn again, yet one window upper right flickered with light, uncertain and irregular, as if someone within could not rest. She thought of the Colonel's trembling hands, Grimley's steadfast propriety, and the faint, persistent smell of smoke that refused to leave the air. Respectability, she mused, was a fireproof word used to hide so much tinder. A night breeze swept across the green, carrying the echo of a door closing soft, deliberate, final. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the darkened house, her mind quietly arranging the first threads of disquiet into the beginnings of a pattern she dared not yet name. The flicker of that restless light stayed in Miss Marple's mind long after the evening quiet reclaimed the green. She sat in her parlor, the small clock marking each second like a heartbeat, her thoughts gliding between fragments, the burnt gloves, the vanished maid, the Colonel's agitation, the butler's arrest. None quite fit together, though each seemed cut from the same cloth of concealment. Respectability, she reflected, was a material that frayed only at the edges. One must look very closely to see where it had begun to tear. The following morning broke grey and uneasy. Word spread that Grimley had been released because of insufficient evidence. Mrs. Bantry was the first to relay the news, calling at Miss Marple's gate in her gardening apron. "They say he's free as you please, and with a face like thunder." Walked straight back to the house, though heaven knows what for. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Some say the inspector changed his mind. Others that Lady Dalrymple demanded his return." Miss Marple thanked her with polite curiosity, though the remark troubled her. A woman fearful enough to request police protection was unlikely to summon home the man accused of betrayal. Fear, when genuine, seldom invited its cause to tea. She fetched her shawl and set out toward the Dalrymple house, ostensibly to deliver a basket of scones for the convalescent lady. The constable at the gate hesitated before allowing her through. "Her ladyship's not receiving," he muttered. "But you may leave those in the kitchen." The air along the drive was damp, carrying a faint metallic tang, not quite smoke, not quite polish. Miss Marple noticed a small trail of dark flecks on the gravel, leading from the side entrance to the shrubbery. She bent discreetly, touching one with her gloved hand. Ash, yes, but finer than that, from a hearth. Perhaps paper, perhaps cloth. Inside, the kitchen was oddly quiet. Grimley stood at the range, his back ramrod straight, polishing a silver tray as though it might answer questions if he rubbed long enough. He turned at her greeting, his expression careful but not insolent. "Mrs. Bantry's kindness, I take it?" he said, gesturing toward the basket. His voice trembled on the edge of fatigue. "Her ladyship thanks you, though she'll not eat. Hasn't since last night." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "Such worry cannot be good for the nerves. And for you too, Mr. Grimley, these have been anxious days." He gave a short, almost bitter laugh. "Anxious, yes, but not without justice, perhaps. I thought myself indispensable once. Servants often do. Then one discovers how easily one can be burned away." Her eyes rested on the silver tray gleaming immaculate, except for a faint crescent smear near the edge. "I do hope," she said softly, "you've not been polishing things that ought instead be left untouched. Sometimes, you know, one destroys more than dust." Their eyes met briefly. Grimley's face tightened, then he bowed slightly. "I see, madam, that you've not lost your powers of observation." He turned back to his work, and she left without further remark. Outside, the mist was thinning. Miss Marple followed the ash trail to where it vanished among the laurel bushes. There, caught in a branch, hung a scrap of grey suede, unmistakably glove material. She lifted it delicately with her handkerchief. The edge was charred, but beneath the soot lingered a faint trace of powder. Not the sort a lady wore, but something coarser, chemical. She folded the fragment carefully and slipped it into her reticule. As she returned toward the village, she found Dr. Haydock waiting by his car near the green. "Ah, Miss Marple, I was just on my way to see you. A curious turn this morning. Lady Dalrymple insists she's well enough to travel and intends to go up to London immediately. I've advised against it, but she's adamant." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, her tone mild. "And the Colonel?" "Refused to accompany her. Quite the scene, by all accounts. She accused him of betrayal, and he called her hysterical. I had to intervene before the constable did." He shook his head. "Between you and me, Jane, I'd say there's something badly wrong in that house." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "There often is, when pride attempts to outrun its own consequences." The afternoon passed in a nervous lull. The post office buzzed with speculation, and Mrs. Price Ridley, triumphant in new gossip, declared that Lady Dalrymple had indeed departed, though not by train or motor car, and at a dreadful speed. Miss Marple listened quietly, sipping her tea, eyes half-focused on nothing in particular. Beneath the tablecloth, her fingers traced the edge of her handkerchief, feeling the roughness of the charred suede within. That evening, when she laid it under the lamplight, the truth of it became plainer. Along the inner seam was a faint imprint of a letter, or perhaps a number pressed into the suede before the burning. She fetched her magnifying glass and studied it. Not a maker's mark, but an initial C. For a long while she sat motionless, hearing only the slow rhythm of her clock. "C," she murmured. "Clara, perhaps. Or Colonel, or something else entirely." The simplest explanations, she knew, were always the ones most politely dismissed. Her candle guttered, casting the room in an unsteady glow. Outside, the wind stirred the lilacs, carrying the scent of them across the garden wall, sweet, deceptive, and faintly ashen. The faint perfume of lilac still drifted through Miss Marple's open window, yet beneath it lay that other scent smoke, or something like it, impossible to forget once noticed. She set the glove fragment carefully into a small envelope, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The initial, half-seared into the suede, seemed almost to pulse under the lamplight. "C," she murmured once in thought, before rising to draw the curtains. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept behind its trim facades, each window a polite mask over restless dreams. Morning came with a pale chill that made the air unusually sharp. Miss Marple's resolve matched it. She dressed early and took the path toward the vicarage, her step slow but purposeful. At the gate she encountered Mrs. Clement, who looked flustered in her gardening gloves. "My dear Jane, you're up and about so early. Have you heard the latest?" The Colonel's disappeared. Miss Marple's brows lifted a fraction. Disappeared? Well, he didn't come home last night. His man says he left after dusk. No word to anyone. The inspector's dreadfully put out. Some say he's fled. Others, Mrs. Clement, hesitated delicately. Others think Lady Dalrymple's departure may not have been entirely voluntary. "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "Then the gloves may not be the only thing burned." At the vicarage breakfast table, Dr. Haydock sat with Inspector Crail, both looking worn by an argument already spent. Crail rose when Miss Marple entered, a hint of irritation under his courtesy. "Morning, ma'am. I suppose the whole parish knows we've lost the Colonel." "Merely misplaced, surely," she replied kindly, taking a seat. "Men of conscience are rarely lost, Inspector." "Only delayed." Crail sighed. "He left a note, if you can call it that, found in the stables. Says he must make things right before the scandal grows. We traced a bicycle missing from the shed. No luggage, no coat. Foolish man. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Clement, her expression serene. People often seek absolution where they first sinned. One might look, perhaps, not along the road, but closer to home. The inspector frowned. You think he's hiding in the village? Not hiding, she said, stirring her tea, reflecting. There is a difference. Dr. Haydock leaned forward. And Lady Dalrymple? No word from her since she left. I'm beginning to think she never reached London at all. Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. If she did, we should have heard. London has a way of magnifying scandal silence and is far more rural. That afternoon, the clouds thickened, pressing low over the green. Miss Marple walked to the edge of the village where the Dalrymple property bordered the old mill pond. The place had long fallen into disuse, the water dark and still as ink. A bicycle lay half-hidden in the reeds. She did not touch it, merely observing the faint tracks leading from the lane and the unmistakable pattern of boot marks beside them. Someone had stood there, watching the water for quite some time. Looking for the colonel, miss. The voice came from behind grimly, his coat buttoned tight despite the humidity. His expression was unreadable, but the tremor in his voice betrayed something unsteady. I thought I might find him near what once reflected his household's good order, she said lightly. One can see quite clearly in still water, though not always what one expects. Grimley's jaw tightened. You speak in riddles, madam. It helps me remember truths, she replied. Such as this, smoke never rises unless something worth concealing is being consumed. He looked away. If you mean the gloves, they were her ladyship's own doing. She gave them to me herself and told me to burn them that night. Said they were stained beyond repair, and when I hesitated, she insisted. He hesitated, as if realizing he'd said too much. She was always particular about what others should see. Miss Marple's tone softened. And what about what others should not see, Mr. Grimley? He stared at her, then turned abruptly and walked away, his pace too fast for dignity. By evening, the inspector's men had recovered the bicycle, and the note roomer, of course, made the rest. At the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley declared she had long suspected the colonel of ungentlemanly habits, while Mrs. Bantry countered that Lady Dalrymple was the true author of every misfortune. Each found comfort in their theory, as people always did when truth was inconveniently absent. Miss Marple dined quietly, her mind drifting toward the burned glove fragment. That single letter C had begun to take on the weight of a cipher through which the human heart revealed its nature. Clara, the maid who vanished, had borne that same initial. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps not. People disappeared in St. Mary Mead for reasons less dramatic than guilt, but rarely so swiftly. Before retiring, she stepped to her garden gate. The night had settled like ink, broken only by a thin crescent moon. Somewhere down the lane a figure moved, carrying a lantern too tall for Grimley, too purposeful for a constable. She watched it pass the hedgerow and vanish toward the mill path. The faintest sound of metal striking stone echoed once, then ceased. Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter. In the darkness, the scent of smoke returned again, unmistakable this time, sharper, nearer, and entirely out of place. She turned toward her cottage, eyes thoughtful, mind aligning every quiet inconsistency into a pattern that was beginning, at last, to take its form. The sharp scent of smoke guided Miss Marple's eyes toward the far end of the lane, where the thin glow of a lantern wavered briefly, then vanished. She stood very still, the night air cool against her face, and listened, but St. Mary Mead had returned to its customary hush. A solitary owl hooted near the vicarage. The quiet, however, felt unnatural, as though something had been removed from it. She returned indoors and drew the curtains, her hands steady but her pulse quickened by that faint metallic smell the wind had carried. It was not the dry scent of wood, nor the sweet smoke of peat. It was acrid, personal something burning that should not have burned at all. By dawn, the village knew. Word travelled faster than the post. A body had been found near the old mill pond. The constable discovered it half in the reeds, half out, face down, one arm extended as if reaching for forgiveness. Colonel Dalrymple. The news struck St. Mary Mead like a sermon gone wrong. Quiet shock at first, then a swelling chorus of speculation. Some whispered suicide, others insisted accident, but in every voice there was the tremor of satisfaction that attends a scandal too large to ignore. Miss Marple, summoned by Dr. Haydock at the inspector's request, arrived at the pond with the calm efficiency of one accustomed to sorrow. The morning mist clung to the water, blurring its edges. 2 constables stood guard, while Inspector Crail crouched by the bank, notebook open. "There you are, ma'am," he said without looking up. "Found just after sunrise. Looks straightforward enough, bicycle tracks, boot prints and a fall. Poor chap must have come here in the night and lost his footing." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "A most convenient explanation, Inspector. But tell me, does guilt usually ride a bicycle through mud?" He sighed, brushing at his coat. "You'd prefer murder, I suppose." "I prefer truth," she said simply, and stepped closer. The colonel's hand, stiff in death, still clutched a piece of torn fabric. It was white linen, faintly singed at one edge, a handkerchief embroidered with the letter D. Miss Marple looked at it for a long moment, then turned her attention to the soil. Beneath the boot marks, she noticed something smaller, a second set of impressions, light and narrow. Women's shoes. One print overlapped his, suggesting a meeting rather than coincidence. Crail followed her gaze and frowned. A visitor, perhaps, or Lady Dalrymple herself before she fled. The coroner will have his say. She fled from something, Miss Marple murmured, but perhaps not from guilt. Her eyes travelled to the far side of the pond, where the reeds bowed oddly, as though something had been dragged through. It might have been nothing, or it might have been an attempt to erase a moment of truth. The inspector straightened. "We'll search the grounds again. I can't have this turning into another village melodrama." "I'm afraid, Inspector," she said gently. "It already has." By mid-morning, the village green was crowded with the decorous chaos of curiosity. Mrs. Bantry, armed with sympathy and parasol, stood near the post office, declaring that poor dear Lady Dalrymple must have discovered her husband's misdeeds and broken down entirely. Mrs. Price Ridley countered that no man of rank ever drowned himself voluntarily. He was pushed, mark my words. Each found virtue in her own conclusion. Miss Marple passed between them like a quiet breeze, offering no opinion, only listening. Beneath gossip's embroidery, she found something else to fear. The villagers were uneasy, not with grief, but with what the incident implied, that behind their curtains, order could falter. At midday, Grimley appeared in the lane, walking stiffly beside the constable. He had been summoned for questioning once more. "I've nothing to hide," he muttered as Miss Marple approached him. "If I'd wanted the colonel dead, there'd be simpler ways." "Indeed," she said softly. "But the truth is seldom simple, Mr. Grimley, especially when it involves loyalty." He looked at her sharply. "Loyalty. To whichever master one serves," she replied. "Living or otherwise." He did not answer. But as the constable led him on, Miss Marple noticed the faint smudge of soot upon his cuff, fresh, not from last night's fires. A man recently near flame, yet whose household hearths had been cold since dawn. That evening, Inspector Crail called upon Miss Marple again. "You were right about the second footprints," he admitted reluctantly. "We found traces of fine suede near the edge, the same as those gloves of hers. I've wired London. If Lady Dalrymple's not there, we'll know soon enough. Miss Marple's fingers paused over her knitting. You think she returned in the night? He shrugged. If she did, she may have seen him or done worse. Either way, she's our missing piece. She inclined her head. Or perhaps, Inspector, our most misplaced one. When he left, Miss Marple remained by the window, gazing at the path toward the pond. The evening light bled into a lilac shadow. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, a solitary crow wheeled above the reeds, its cry sharp and lonely. In her lap lay the charred glove fragment she had kept, the one marked with the letter C. She traced its edge thoughtfully. 3 letters now bound the mystery, like the initials in a half-written confession, C.D. and whatever name remained unspoken between them. A sudden knock startled her. Dr. Haydock entered, face grave. "Jane," he said quietly, "there's been another discovery. Not a person this time, a letter. Found near the Colonel's coat pocket. It bears her handwriting." Miss Marple looked up, calm but alert. "And what does it say?" He hesitated. "It says, 'I forgive you.'" She folded her hands, her voice almost tender. How merciful, and how dreadfully convenient. Dr. Haydock's quiet words seemed to linger in the air long after he had gone, as though the echo of forgiveness itself demanded suspicion. Miss Marple sat still, hands folded, the ticking of her clock like small, deliberate footsteps across thought. A letter of pardon found on a dead man's person was too apt, too symmetrical. Life, she knew, rarely arranged its tragedies so neatly. Someone, somewhere, had been tidying. Outside, the night pressed close. A faint mist rose from the green, and the lamplight blurred into softness. Miss Marple moved to the hearth, touching the charred glove fragment still resting upon her table. The suede, when turned beneath the light, caught a strange gleam, something metallic, perhaps powder residue, now dulled with time. She opened her bureau drawer and retrieved an old envelope from years past, one that still carried a faint whiff of phosphorus ink. Her suspicion sharpened. Not ashes from a hearth, then. Ashes from ignition. She did not sleep that night. At first light she walked to the vicarage, shawl drawn tight. Mrs. Clement greeted her with anxious brightness. "Terrible business, Jane. Dr. Haydock says the Colonel's death was certainly drowning, but there's confusion over the time of it." His watch stopped at 1:30. 1:30, Miss Marple repeated mildly. Curious how watches sometimes stop for reasons other than water. The vicar himself entered, holding a telegram. "From London, my dear," he said. "Lady Dalrymple never arrived. The chauffeur reports she dismissed him halfway to Melchester and insisted on continuing alone." Miss Marple accepted the telegram, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then she vanished of her own accord, or of another's intention. She looked toward the window, where sunlight trembled faintly through lace curtains. "Would you mind, Leonard, if I borrowed the church keys? I wish to examine something." Within the hour, she stood in the vestry, cool, dim, and faintly scented with polish and old linen. The choir stalls gleamed in orderly silence. Near the side table lay a bundle of discarded altar cloths, freshly washed. Miss Marple lifted one and found beneath it a small silver lighter, its edge engraved with curling initials, C.D. The metal was dulled, but faint scorch marks darkened its base. Relic, perhaps, or an oversight. She slipped it into her pocket and left unnoticed. The inspector found her soon after at her gate. "Ah, Miss Marple, I might have known. You've heard our news? Grimley's gone missing now, too. Left before dawn, took nothing but his coat." "How inconvenient," she said gently. "When one's servants begin to vanish, it usually means one's secrets are already out." Crail scowled. "You sound as though you've already solved it." "I rarely solve anything, Inspector," she replied with a faint smile. "I simply wait until people stop pretending." That afternoon she set her small trap as quietly and naturally as she brewed her tea. She asked Dr. Haydock to call at her cottage on a matter of delicate judgment, and word of it, she knew, would travel swiftly through the village to every interested ear. By dusk, as she poured the second cup, she heard the gate creak open. Not Haydock lighter footsteps, hesitant, burdened with decision. Grimly. He entered unannounced, pale and trembling. "Miss Marple." "Shouldn't have come," he stammered, "but it's gone too far." She offered him tea without surprise. "Truth usually does, Mr. Grimley. Milk or lemon?" He sat, eyes hollow. It wasn't murder, not at first. She wanted to frighten him. Said the colonel had written to that girl, Clara. The maid was his daughter, you see. Born before the marriage, when he served abroad. Her ladyship found out only weeks ago. She meant to burn the proof, not the girl. But Clara ran before she could stop her. "And the fire?" Miss Marple asked softly. "She made me burn the gloves and the letter together," he said, voice breaking. "Said the ashes would clear her name. I thought it over then, the smell, the smoke, but she wouldn't hear the reason. When the colonel found her by the pond, she meant to confess. He tried to take the blame, saying he'd drown himself if it would end the talk. And then she struck him, only meant to push, I swear." He fell. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "And what of Lady Dalrymple?" He bowed his head. "I helped her leave, ma'am. Drove her halfway and let her go near the quarry road. She said she'd rather vanish than hang." A long silence followed, broken only by the soft clink of the teacup against its saucer. Miss Marple spoke at last, gently but with steel. "You've been loyal beyond your duty, Mr. Grimley, but loyalty that hides truth is a poor sort of virtue. The inspector must hear this from you, not from gossip." He nodded, defeated. "I'll tell him. Only will you see she's treated kindly?" Miss Marple's voice softened to a near whisper. "Justice, when tempered with understanding, can be very gentle indeed." When he had gone, she extinguished her lamp and stood by the window once more. The village lay still, its peace seemingly restored. Yet behind that calm, she sensed the echo of all that had burned the gloves, the letters, the facades. In the fading light, the lighter in her pocket grew warm against her palm, as though carrying its own faint memory of flame. The faint warmth of the lighter in Miss Marple's hand seemed to pulse with its own quiet confession. She turned it once more between her fingers before setting it gently on the table beside the lamp. The flame it had once sparked had consumed more than paper. It had devoured reputations, illusions, and the fragile fabric of domestic peace that St. Mary Mead prized so dearly. Yet there was still one ember of truth left to be uncovered, and Miss Marple knew precisely how to coax it into light. By morning, Inspector Crail arrived in his usual brisk manner, boots muddy from the green, his expression one of weary suspicion. "So, Miss Marple," he said, glancing about her parlour, "I've just heard an extraordinary statement from Grimley. Wild as a March hare, that man. Claims Lady Dalrymple struck her husband by accident. Says she ran off to save him from scandal. A convenient tale, isn't it?" Miss Marple folded her hands serenely. "Convenience is rarely the measure of truth, Inspector. It's often what makes falsehood tolerable." He frowned. "Do you believe him?" "I believe," she said, "that people's worst deeds are often born of their best intentions." Grimley's loyalty blinded him, but his remorse spoke plainly. The difficulty, of course, is proof. Crail dropped into a chair with a sigh. "Proof's what we lack. If she's alive, she's hiding well. We've searched as far as Melchester. No sign. And the maid, Clara, still vanished." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the morning sun touched the lilac blooms. "Sometimes, Inspector, what we seek is not gone at all. It is merely disguised." She rose, took the small envelope from her writing desk, and handed it to him. Inside lay the charred suede fragment. "I found this in the Dalrymple garden. It bears the initial C. Clara's, you might think. But it isn't. The stitching is finer, the scent faintly of her ladyship's perfume. Yet the mark was pressed with something sharp, a signet ring perhaps. The colonel's ring bears a C entwined with a D. Crail turned the fragment over in his hand, eyes narrowing. Then it's from his glove. From hers, she corrected gently, but marked by him. They shared more than quarrels, Inspector. They shared guilt. She led him to the door and down the path toward the green. The village seemed almost indecently bright that morning, the air crisp with the promise of ordinary life. "Do you know what most often betrays murderers?" she asked lightly. "Footprints, perhaps," he said dryly. "Or conscience?" "Neither," said Miss Marple. "It's tidiness, the irresistible urge to put things right. Lady Dalrymple's whole existence has been spent polishing surfaces. She would never leave chaos behind, not even in tragedy." Crail stopped short. "You think she's still here?" Miss Marple nodded toward the churchyard. "I think she never truly left. There is one place in St. Mary Mead where a woman may rest unseen, yet remain close enough to watch whether her secret endures." They reached the church just as Dr. Haydock emerged, cap in hand. "Good heavens, Jane, you do get about early. They've opened the old crypt for repair. Quite the dust storm down there. The verger says it's full of old trunks and clothes from estate donations." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. "Donations, yes. I dare say some of them are more recent than others." She descended into the crypt with Crail following reluctantly behind. The air was cool, thick with the scent of damp stone and candle wax. In the corner lay a heap of covered boxes, one larger chest draped with linen. She approached it, her fingers brushing the faint scorch marks along the edge. "Fire again," she murmured. "The hand that burns never forgets the motion." Crail drew back the cloth. Inside, lying as though in uneasy sleep, was Lady Dalrymple. Her face, pale and still, bore the faintest trace of soot across one glove. In her other hand, she clutched a half-written note, the rest of the letter she had begun for her husband. "Forgive me, for it was I who—" The ink had blurred where water or tears had fallen. Crail swallowed hard. "So that's the end of it." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "The end, Inspector, is a matter of conscience. The beginning, however, lies elsewhere. This poor lady never intended for her husband's death, but appearances demanded that one of them must be spotless, and so she cleansed him in fire and herself in water." They stood in silence for a time. The faint echo of footsteps above reminded them that life continued even above secrets. When they emerged into sunlight again, the village looked deceptively tranquil. Mrs. Bantry was tending her roses, Mrs. Price Ridley bustling toward the grocer's, the vicar's wife hanging lace curtains to dry. Nothing had changed outwardly. And yet Miss Marple knew that beneath the varnish of decency, a shadow lingered, the quiet guilt that came from knowing one's gossip had outpaced one's compassion. She paused by the gate as Crail closed his notebook. "Will you report it as an accident, Inspector?" she asked. He hesitated. "Perhaps. There's mercy in it." "Mercy," she said softly, "is the only truth worth writing down." As he departed, Miss Marple remained by the churchyard wall. The breeze stirred the lilac petals at her feet, carrying with it the faintest trace of smoke. Somewhere within that scent was the memory of what had been destroyed and what, by quiet grace, had been forgiven. The faint smoke scent that drifted from the churchyard lingered through the morning like a memory unwilling to fade. Miss Marple stood a long while by the gate, her gloved hands folded lightly over her umbrella, watching the lilac petals shiver across the path. The air was still, but charged as though the quiet village itself hesitated before resuming its performance of innocence. Death in St. Mary Mead was never quite final until it had been politely discussed over tea. By midday, the drawing rooms hummed again. Mrs. Bantry, in a hat too bright for mourning, told anyone who would listen that poor Lady Dalrymple must have lost her reason from remorse. Mrs. Price Ridley disagreed with the brisk certainty of one who had never known self-doubt. It was weakness, not madness. One cannot expect moral stamina from people who keep foreign servants. Between the two, the village achieved its equilibrium of judgment and justification. Respectability, that old fabric, was being rewoven stitch by complacent stitch. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat with Dr. Haydock in the vicarage garden, where the smell of earth and roses almost masked the damp trace of the past days. The doctor looked older, more tired than usual. "You know," he said, "if she'd come to me, I might have helped her." The mind breaks first in silence. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, eyes distant. "I suppose we all liked her too well to see her clearly." "That," Miss Marple replied, "is the most frequent cause of tragedy and affection without understanding. We forgive people's manners, but never their motives." She smiled faintly, her knitting steady. "It's quite human. We prefer the smoke to what's burning." Haydock gave a weary chuckle. "You and your metaphors. You ought to write sermons." "Perhaps," she said mildly, "but the congregation seldom wishes to hear about itself." The inspector arrived a little later, hat in hand. "We've settled it, ma'am," he said. "Officially accidental death. The coroner's satisfied. Her brother's coming down from Surrey to arrange what's left. It's as tidy an ending as one could hope for." "Tidy," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "A word that soothes the living, Inspector, but never quite consoles the dead." Crail frowned, uncertain whether she rebuked or agreed with him. "At any rate," he said after a pause, "it's finished." She inclined her head. "For the record, yes. But records are such untrustworthy things. They never account for what people truly meant." When he had gone, she lingered among the flower beds, the low hum of bees surrounding her like the faint chorus of some domestic benediction. Yet the peace of the moment carried its own melancholy. Lady Dalrymple's story would become another village parable reduced to a caution about pride, then softened into gossip, then forgotten altogether. Only Miss Marple would remember the trembling of the woman's hands, the meticulousness of her gloves, the fragile decency that had driven her to despair. Appearances, after all, were the final refuge of those who could no longer bear truth. Toward evening she walked home by the pond. The water lay still, a dark mirror reflecting the gold of the sinking sun. A few withered petals floated on its surface, delicate as ash. She paused by the bank, the reeds whispering softly in the breeze, and looked down. In the shifting reflection she saw her own face, calm, composed, faintly saddened, and behind it the outline of the church spire. For an instant the image blurred, dissolving distinctions of sin and virtue, of who had forgiven whom. When she reached her cottage, the postman had left the day's letters. Among them was one without direction or signature, the paper thick and faintly scented. Inside lay a single pressed violet and a scrap of handwriting. "Thank you for kindness unspoken." Miss Marple stood at the window, turning it over in the evening light. The handwriting was delicate, uncertain, a woman's hand, perhaps Clara's, perhaps not. Either way, it spoke of someone who had learned the cost of silence. She placed the violet carefully beside her lamp and resumed her seat by the hearth. The fire crackled gently, content to burn ordinary wood again. From outside came the murmured sounds of domestic life, a piano scale from the vicarage, a cart rumbling toward the inn, the steady rhythm of existence reasserting itself. Miss Marple watched the flame curl along the log, her expression unreadable. "So much trouble," she murmured, "to keep a conscience clean." The light flickered, brightened, and steadied a small, steadfast glow against the deepening dusk. And with that calm, almost imperceptible gesture of the fire reclaiming its quiet work, The village of St. Mary Mead resumed its proper order, the last trace of scandal settling into the comfortable dust of memory. The fire settled into a slow rhythm of breathing, its light casting long fingers along the parlor wall. Miss Marple sat unmoving, her hands resting in her lap, the faint scent of violets lingering from the letter that now lay folded beside her teacup. Outside, the night had deepened into that particular stillness that belongs only to villages after the scandal, a quietness both watchful and relieved, as though the place itself had drawn a curtain over its conscience. The clock ticked, measured, patient, yet in its steady beat there was a reminder that no human order, however restored, is entirely free of ghosts. A knock came, discreet and unhurried. She opened the door to find the vicar's wife standing there, a shawl clutched at her throat. "Jane, I do beg your pardon for the hour," said Mrs. Clement, her voice flurried yet sincere. "I thought perhaps you might still be awake. I've just come from the Dalrymple house." Miss Marple stepped aside without surprise. "I rather thought you might." She ushered her guest into the warm glow of the sitting room. Mrs. Clement looked pale, not from fear, but from the shock of compassion unaccustomed. "You've seen the brother?" "Yes," Mrs. Clement said, perching on the edge of the armchair. "He's very quiet and terribly kind in his way. I think he means to keep the house. He said something rather odd, though. He asked whether the villagers would forgive the family. I told him, of course, there was nothing to forgive, but she hesitated, her face clouded. He seemed relieved, Jane. That's what disturbed me. Relieved as though he'd expected us all to blame him personally for the ruin." Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea, her expression unreadable. Families often inherit guilt as others inherit furniture. Some pieces cannot be discarded, they simply get dusted from time to time. Mrs. Clement sighed. "You always find the right words. I wish the same could be said for the inspector. He came to see the brother, too, still muttering about inconsistencies. The death, he says, is tidy but not clean. He even suggested the colonel might have been dead before the fall. I do wish he'd stop. There must be an end somewhere." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm beneath the talk. "Inspector Crail," she said, "is quite right to mistrust symmetry. It's the neatness of this affair that troubles him. A drowning, a confession, a vanished letter, a widow's remorse all too balanced. Real life has a way of wobbling at the edges." The vicar's wife shivered faintly. "I suppose you're right. Still, I shall sleep better knowing it's over." Miss Marple smiled, but her eyes remained distant. Over, yes. Though endings, like ashes, tend to drift when the wind changes. After Mrs. Clement departed, the house grew very still again. Yet Miss Marple did not retire. She sat by the lamp, unfolding the anonymous letter once more, studying the penmanship in the wavering light. The words were graceful, but uncertain, written by someone who had once been taught to write carefully, then lived long enough to forget why precision mattered. The faint scent of violets carried something else beneath it, a whisper of soap from hard work, the honest faint tang of starch. A lady would never use such stationery, but a maid might if she'd borrowed it. She rose, fetched her spectacles, and examined the postmark. Melchester. The same place where Lady Dalrymple's chauffeur had left her on the road that final night. The corners of Miss Marple's mouth softened into something very near satisfaction. Morning brought sunlight and a certain tentative cheerfulness. The village returned to its routines as though it had been granted absolution by daylight. Miss Marple, carrying a small parcel, walked toward the post office. Mrs. Bantry was there already, of course, discussing the late Lady Dalrymple's generosity and bequests. "They say she left funds for the parish school," Mrs. Bantry confided, lowering her voice. "And a sum for that poor girl Clara, wherever she's gone. Most touching, don't you think?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed," Lady Dalrymple was always conscientious about her duties, particularly when they required concealment. Mrs. Bantry blinked. Concealment? Reparation, perhaps? Miss Marple amended gently. A lady of principle can commit terrible acts when she believes morality depends upon secrecy. She left the post office with her parcel unopened, taking the long way home by the mill path. The water, clear now, caught the morning light like burnished glass. Where the reeds had bent under tragedy, fresh shoots already leaned toward the sun. Nature, Miss Marple reflected, was infinitely forgiving, unlike respectability, which forgave nothing but forgetfulness. At her gate stood Inspector Crail, hat in hand, his expression half apologetic. "I thought I'd catch you before church," he said. "Telegram from Melchester. Thought you'd like to see it." He handed her the slip. It read simply, "Clara safe. Working under a new name. Will not return. Grateful for kindness. M. She murmured, eyes softening. Mercy, perhaps, or merely Melchester. Crail gave a wry smile. "So that's the final mystery solved, eh?" "Final?" She smiled faintly. "Oh no, Inspector. Just the only one anyone will write down." He frowned, uncertain, but she only thanked him and turned back toward her gate. The faint perfume of lilacs drifted on the breeze again, sweet and faintly bitter. It was the smell of renewal and of remembrance. That afternoon she took her tea in the garden, the pressed violet still resting beside her saucer. The vicar's wife waved from across the hedge, and the butcher's boy whistled down the lane. St. Mary Mead had returned to itself, as it always did, stitching order over sorrow with thread too fine to see. Yet even as she listened to the bees humming in her lavender, Miss Marple felt a small unease, a whisper of incompletion. Some truths, she thought, preferred the safety of partial revelation. The church bell rang for evensong. She rose, gathering her shawl, and glanced once toward the distant Dalrymple house, its windows shuttered now, its gardens newly tended by a stranger's hand. In the soft gold of late day, the house appeared almost peaceful, though a single plume of chimney smoke rose lazily from its kitchen hearth. Miss Marple watched it a moment longer, her eyes thoughtful. There was something curiously comforting in that smoke proof that life persisted, though the ashes beneath told another story. She turned toward the lane, her step measured and sure, the last light tracing silver on her hair. Behind her, the smoke thinned into the sky, pale and unassuming, until it was indistinguishable from the clouds.